most faithful defenders of freedom and liberty that you could ever hope to find in this world. I'd like to introduce a few of them right now. If you would just please hold your applause. Speaker Robin Vos, thank you for being here. Assembly Majority Leader, sorry for the demotion there, Jim Steineke, and Senate Assistant Majority Leader Dan Fine. Thank you guys for being here. We also have many distinguished guests who are here today, and though I don't have time to recognize everybody, I'd just like to introduce a few of them now. From the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Chicago, we have Director General Eric Wang, we have Deputy Director General Edward Chen, we have Deputy Director Abigail Chu. The Free People of Wisconsin stand together with the Free People of Taiwan. We thank you for being here. And I think nowhere in the world is democracy as fragile today than in Hong Kong. And we are honored to have with us from the Hong Kong Student Association right here at UW-Madison, Marco Lam. Where are you, Marco? Thank you for being here. Thank you. Today is truly a historic day in the state capitol in this chamber because we have the honor of being joined by the 70th United States Secretary of State, the Honorable Michael R. Pompeo. Never before in the history of our state has a Secretary of State taken the time to come to our state capitol to interact with leaders and policymakers, and we are honored to have him here. The purpose of the Secretary's visit today is for a discussion about foreign policy, specifically as it relates with China. Foreign diplomacy affects our daily life in ways we do not often recognize, in some ways dramatically affecting the products we buy or policies we abide by for decades. In past times, a secretary could effectively do their job from Washington on our behalf, but not today. The 21st century is more connected than ever, making open and direct communication with our federal government of utmost importance. Here in Wisconsin, we are the 19th largest state exporter of goods in our country, totaling $22.7 billion of made in American goods around the world. And of that, China is now our third largest trading partner. Over the last decade, our state has seen an increase of 10% in exported goods, the largest industries being in manufacturing and agriculture, which are the lifeblood of our economy and the pride of our state. The State Department partners with Wisconsin on counterterrorism efforts, international exchange programs within our university system, and foreign economic market entry, promoting our economic interests and advancing our country's role in the world. I've invited Secretary Pompeo to come visit Wisconsin, quite simply, to hear from all of you. And you know what? Secretary Pompeo has been hard at work for our country and for our state since his appointment by President Trump in 2018. The Secretary previously served as the Director of the CIA, 4 terms as the Congressman from Kansas's 4th District. But most significantly to me and my military colleagues here today, Secretary Pompeo graduated first in his class at the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1986. And he served as a cavalry officer patrolling the Iron Curtain before the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Secretary has made a conscious effort to address foreign policy issues that play a role in our state and local governments, connecting the national foreign policy conversation to those like you that it impacts here at home. Whether that be speaking to the National Governors Association or coming to our state capitol today to talk with you directly. So with that, would you please join me now in a warm welcome to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo.
Thanks, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be back here. It's great to be back in the Midwest. When I was flying in today, it looked a little like Kansas. Made me warm all over. Thanks. It looks like we're going to get some Big Ten football. That's good, too. Yeah. I was also reminded when Roger introduced me as the 70th Secretary of State that President Trump is the 45th president, so there's a lot more turnover in my job. And so I'll do my best to hang on. Thanks for inviting me here, Roger. It took us a little while to put this all together with all that's going on. And thanks to all the distinguished members of the Wisconsin State Legislature here, friends from the business community, some of whom I had a chance to spend a few minutes with. Thank you for your commitment to this great country of ours. This venue, my goodness, it's gorgeous. Second prettiest venue after Lambeau Field, right, in Wisconsin? A lot of people were kidding with me before I came here. Indeed, some of the political press in Washington was saying, what the heck's Secretary going to Wisconsin for? I know, it's not a country. I get it. But what goes on here and the work that you all do is so important to the mission that I have and my team has at the State Department that I feel like it's my responsibility to get out and talk to you about what we're doing on behalf of the people of Wisconsin, the people of America. As Americans across the country, we're dealing with the pandemic that was released from Wuhan. They've been worried about their lives, their livelihoods. Senator Roth got an email from Wu Ting, a person who was the consul, China's consul in Chicago. It landed in his email inbox. Ms. Wu stated that she was responsible for China-Wisconsin relations. The email included a draft resolution that she asked the senator to pass in this chamber praising China's response to the coronavirus. I want to just take a second to read a few excerpts. She wrote, whereas China's action has been critical to the global fight against the epidemic, and China has adapted unprecedented and rigorous measures for disease control and prevention, whereas China has been transparent and quick in sharing key information of the virus with the World Health Organization and the international community. Roger, rightfully, thankfully, deleted the email. Thought it was a hoax. I can tell you that the description, how she described the actions that the Chinese Communist Party took in response to the virus, were in fact all false. Of course, he got a follow-up email. She helpfully attached a revised version of the proposed resolution. And Roger wrote a one-word response. He said, nuts. That has a lot of American history, that word, and that response. And the chutzpah from an American who understood what it is that's in the best interest of our country. Look, the Chinese Communist Party knew early on how virulent the coronavirus was that originated in Wuhan. They did what authoritarian regimes do. They suppressed information, they censored, they disappeared courageous whistleblowers and journalists who tried to sound the alarm all across the world. And they allowed people from Wuhan to travel to Italy and abroad. Ms. Wu was asking that we, collectively, whitewash the culpability for a global pandemic that's killed more than 200,000 Americans, now nearly 1 million people across the globe, and has sent the global economy into a tailspin. Roger didn't take the bait. Instead, Roger presented a resolution stating that the Communist Party of China deliberately, intentionally misled the world on the Wuhan coronavirus. It's true. But here's my question, and here's where I want to launch today. How many of you would have seen that and thought something different? Or maybe even worked with her? I'm sure she's a nice person. It's an uncomfortable set of questions when we think about what the Chinese Communist Party is doing through their embassies here in the United States. But what happened here in Wisconsin is happening all across the world. It's happening all across the United States. It's happening in state houses all across America. In February of this year, I delivered a set of remarks to the National Governors Association about Chinese Communist Party influence operations right here inside the United States of America. And then subsequently, I organized a group. National Security Advisor O'Brien, FBI Director Chris Wray, Attorney General Bill Barr have all talked about this same set of challenges that we face here in the United States. I want to distinguish, importantly, two things. First, look, plenty of countries try to influence our politics and our culture, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not worried about the Alliance Francaise or the National Italian American Organization or an Irish group. They're fundamentally different than what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. It has a much more sinister view of this engagement. The party and its proxies aim to make Americans receptive to Beijing's form authoritarianism. Now, I use this language carefully. I talk about the Chinese Communist Party because I have a second distinction I want to draw, which is between that party and the people of China, between the leaders of China and those who want to live in China as free peoples, peace and prosperity, and take care of their families in the same way that we all do here in the United States. Let me give you another data point on the Chinese Communist Party's aims. In August, General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, told a group of government economists and sociologists in Beijing, quote, "We must actively develop cooperation with all countries, regions, and enterprises willing to cooperate with us, including states, localities, and enterprises inside the United States." As the Secretary of State and as the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, let me translate. She knows that the federal government is pushing back against the Chinese Communist Party here in the United States and its malign influence, and it sees that here in the United States and increasingly around the world, it can use subnational entities to circumvent America's sovereignty. He thinks local leaders may well be the weak link. For him, when he uses the word cooperation and opening up, he means that the Chinese Communist Party wants to create arrangements that benefit the Chinese Communist Party. We know this because for decades, the Chinese Communist Party deployed friendly language while stealing from our innovators, property, jobs, wealth from here in the United States. We know that they built their military strength and that they have co-opted elites all around the world. Later, in that same set of remarks, General Secretary Xi said that, in fact, he explicitly confirms that the purpose of his entreaties, his outreach, is to put China in an undefeatable and invincible position. His words, not mine. The Chinese Communist Party views itself as the true vanguard of Marxist-Leninist thought, which proposes that communist countries like theirs must struggle and prevail against capitalist nations like ours. This isn't the Cold War. This is different in kind, to be sure. I was a young soldier. I patrolled the border between East and West Germany. This is different. It's why we have to have a conversation in our state legislatures about this China and this China challenge. And it's important here in Wisconsin as it is in Washington. The good news. The good news is that we're starting to have these conversations all around America, not a moment too soon. President Trump has made clear the expectations he has for our government, our administration, and how we'll respond to this challenge to protect the American people, to create prosperity and grow our economy. But we watch these CCP campaigns targeting state-level officials, local interests. We've seen them at PTA meetings. They've been in full swing for years, and they're increasing in intensity. Much of that activity revolves around pressing state governments not to recognize, trade with, or otherwise engage with Taiwan. But that's not all. I'll give another example. And I could give many. In 2017, a California state senator proposed a bill merely expressing support for the Falun Gong practitioners in America and in China. It was oratory. It was a rhetorical resolution. These people that he was speaking to have suffered as tremendously under the Chinese Communist Party's crackdowns on religious freedom as any others. The Chinese consulate, that is, Chinese diplomats, in San Francisco responded by writing a letter to the state legislature. It denounced the Falun Gong as an evil cult and claimed that the bill might deeply damage the cooperative relations between the state of California and China and seriously hurt the feeling of Chinese people in the vast Chinese community inside of California. Unfortunately, the California State Senate bowed to the CCP pressure and shelved the proposed bill. It's just one example. The reality is that most every state legislature in the country has probably received a letter from the CCP, much like Senator Ross' email, as part of a coordinated propaganda campaign. The Chinese consulate in New York, for instance, is incredibly politically active. Then there's the next level down. CCP influence and espionage campaigns at the municipal and city levels. Just this week, you would have read in the papers, the Department of Justice charged a New York Police Department officer, an Army reservist, with allegedly acting as an illegal agent of China. He's accused of reporting on the activities of Tibetans living in the United States back to the Chinese Communist Party. How telling. He even provided CCP officials with access to senior-level NYPD personnel through invitations to official events. Sound familiar to anyone? He told his handler that officials in Beijing, quote, should be happy because you've stretched your reach into the police, end of quote. And we see it all over. We see it all over in American sister city programs like the ones in Door County, La Crosse, Milwaukee, and Richland Center. They fall under the authority of something called the Chinese People's Association of Friendship with Foreign Countries. Sounds benign. But that group is part of China's United Front Work Department, the CCP's official overseas propaganda tool. It's one of the CCP's 3 magic weapons, in the words of Chairman Mao, along with armed struggle and party building. In other words, it may have friendly in its title, but it is not so when it comes to American interests. Look, the federal government can't police every bit of this predatory and coercive behavior. We need your help. And the beauty of our federal system is that we don't have to. You all can take up this mantle. Protecting American interests requires vigilance. Vigilance that starts with you and all state legislators, regardless of party. Know that when you're approached by a Chinese diplomat, it is likely not in the spirit of cooperation or friendship. Know that if you're offered a trip to China when the pandemic travel restrictions are lifted, that you should ask who's paying for the trip, and if that person is linked, directly or indirectly, to the Chinese Communist Party. Know, too, that these approaches may happen from Chinese national or Americans working with CCP-linked interests. When you're in your districts, make sure other local officials know of these risks as well. And there's a lot you can do. There's a lot you can do in this very chamber. You can pass laws to codify closer cooperation with federal agencies to assist them in the protection of intellectual property and investment screening and counter-infiltration operations. You can ignore CCP threats and encourage mayors and business people to engage more broadly around the world. And as I told the nation's governors, you can scrutinize your state pension funds. As of its last report, the Wisconsin retirement system has invested in China Mobile and China Telecom. Both are state-owned giants, and they're an integral part of Chinese Orwellian surveillance system. Do you want your teachers, your firefighters, your policemen invested in those kinds of activities? You can also work to ensure your state colleges aren't improperly influenced by CCP-linked organizations like the Confucius Institutes, and that pro-democracy students from China, Hong Kong, or Taiwan studying in Wisconsin are not harassed. We want them here. Make sure they're not being threatened by pro-Beijing elements on your campuses. Telling the truth about China isn't remotely partisan. It's principled, and it protects our people. Remember Ms. Wu at the consulate? Well, on April 2nd of this year, she forwarded a letter from her husband to the Consul General in Chicago, to the district director of a great Wisconsin congressman named Mike Gallagher. The letter is full of CCP propaganda and disinformation about the pandemic, just like the one that was sent to Senator Roth. But what caught my eye in this missive was her declaration. She said, "We are firmly opposed to racial discrimination and xenophobia against the local Chinese community and stigmatization of China and the Chinese people over this virus." They try to shape the storyline. They want you to believe that America's righteous anger at the CCP over its handling of the coronavirus has something to do with race. It does not. It has everything to do with citizens who are no longer with us, children who aren't able to go back to school, and jobs that have been lost. And importantly, the Chinese Communist Party knows this. The CCP thinks it can drown out American cries for accountability with shouts of racism. We won't let that happen. We can't. The CCP wants to foment the kind of strife we've seen in Minneapolis and Portland and Kenosha. That's disgusting. We can't let it happen. I'm confident it won't. I'm always an optimist about America. There's a reason that we remain the greatest nation in the history of civilization, because Beijing's best-laid plans are no match for American determination. The Trump administration rejects the idea that Beijing is destined for hegemony. No top-down, totalitarian regime can ever best the ingenuity, will, power of the American people. We know that our system is more attractive to others. I see it wherever I go. People want to be connected to the United States of America. They want to join with us freely because they know that we too stand for freedom alongside them. And we're not going to allow the CCP to interfere in our domestic politics either. We put restriction on Chinese diplomats that mirror the ones American diplomats are subject to inside of China. It's remarkable. For years, our diplomats couldn't move around in Beijing, couldn't meet with local officials, while Chinese diplomats ran free all across our country. Fairness, reciprocity, equality, that's how diplomats will be treated in the Trump administration. We want to confirm American business is successful above all because of its moral standards. We've warned our businesses and universities to make sure that they aren't unwittingly supporting the mass human rights abuses happening in Xinjiang province right now, even as we're here together today. Right now, the FBI opens a China-related intellectual property theft case about once every 10 hours. It's staggering. We, the State Department, just revoked visas for about 1,000 Chinese nationals suspected of raiding our intellectual property on university campuses all across America. We want to make sure we protect our children from the CCP's malign influence. We've formally designated the Confucius Institute's U.S. headquarters as a foreign mission and encouraged universities to shutter the doors on these programs quickly. And right now, the State Department is reviewing the activities of two United Front Work Department organizations operating inside the United States. One, the U.S.-China Friendship Association, the other, the China Council for the Promotion of Peaceful Reunification. These organizations include or have apparently attempted to exert influence on groups all across the public sphere, including in our schools and our business associations, impacting local politicians, media outlets, and Chinese groups here inside the United States. We want to make sure that we get it all right, that we're fighting to protect our wallets, our hearts, our minds, and our freedoms. Each of us as public officials must never be complacent or complicit in the CCP's campaign to fracture American society and to silence American voices. Every one of us, and I know you'll join me in this, must stand up for our sovereignty and for our American values themselves. Democrat, Republican, Independent, you have a friend in the Trump administration to help you push back against the CCP's exploitation of our open society. Let's do this together for the American people and the future of the greatest democracy in history. Thanks for letting me be with you today. I look forward to taking some questions from you. We can have a good discussion. May God bless Wisconsin and the United States of America. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciated those remarks. Now you got the hot job, though. That's a hot seat that we have you in here.
No worries.
I went and reached out to our legislators who are here today and just asked them to send questions to me. And I reworked some of them just so we could try and get a flow here. But I'm just going to give you a little, I guess, bird's eye view of what people are thinking here. And hopefully you can provide some perspective for us. So the first question actually comes from two senators. One is Senator Steve Nass. He is a retired Chief Master Sergeant in the Air National Guard. And then also Senator Dale Koinga, who is currently serving as a major in the Wisconsin Army National Guard. They're off to your right. And they're basically wondering something I think we've heard a lot about, that the traditional thinking in China is that if we open up their markets, and make them more traditional and bring them more into the norms that we see, international norms when it comes to trade and so forth, that's going to bring them further towards a democratic way of governing. Yet, if we look over the last, say, 20 years, we've seen, China increasing its grip. We see the issues with the Uyghur Muslims. We see what happened in Hong Kong earlier this year. And then, as Senator Nassa points to, the militarization of the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. So the question is, Is this traditional thinking in regards to market forces enforcing these democratic systems, or do we need a fundamental realignment in the approach?
Yeah. It's perhaps a central question. Where, is Master Sergeant here somewhere?
He is in the second row. Steve Noss.
I've always been scared of Master Sergeant. as a young lieutenant, I knew who was really in charge. So for 50 years, U.S. policy had as its central theme, if we trade with them enough, then they will open up and they'll stop the predatory economic activity will cease. Right? That's what impacts us in the United States. So for all the human rights problems and all the challenges inside of China, what we're most interested in is making sure that we compete with every nation on a set of fair and level trading rules, and that everyone abides by the same central ideas of sovereignty and recognition of the rule of law. And the theory was, if you trade with them enough, they'll grow enough, they'll bring hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, which they've done, and that kind of behavior will change. And I gave remarks at the Nixon Library now a couple of months back where I made very clear that's failed. It didn't work. The theory that President Nixon and Dr. Kissinger had, and Dr. Kissinger's become a good friend, it may have been the right thing for the early 1970s, and it may well have been worth trying through the 80s and 90s, but we know that it didn't deliver for the American people, because you can see the tens of millions of jobs lost as a result of intellectual property threat and forced technology transfers that have had to take place from businesses right here in Wisconsin. We think about the largest businesses, but small and medium businesses. I ran a small business in Kansas for years. You could see them. They wanted to see our drawings. They wanted to see our engineering in order to trade with them. We have to fundamentally use the set of tools we have, the power that the United States has to simply demand a set of fair and reciprocal relationships in every dimension with China. I get asked another element of this question is, well, what does President Trump want this to look like? What does the relationship look like 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now? And the answer is, it looks like a relationship that is fair and balanced, and where one nation doesn't threaten another or another set of countries' livelihoods. And so that's what we've been driving towards. So we welcome when China shows up and competes on a fair and equitable basis and is a supplier to a company, that's great. But what we see in far too many cases is the flip side of that, which is an inequitable relationship, people who won't respect property rights, people where there's no remedy, there's no judicial remedy for these wrongs, and it is a predatory activity that is just simply unacceptable to allow to continue.
Thank you.
And more trade, increasing activity is unlikely to do anything but fuel their capacity to continue that kind of inequitable, oppressive behavior.
So the next question, which kind of follows that a bit, this comes from Speaker Robin Vos. You had an opportunity to meet him earlier. He's the popcorn king here in Wisconsin, got his own small business there. But as China's moved over the last couple of decades, particularly the last 10 years, they're expanding. They're trying to invest in the world. They've got the Belt and Road Initiative, which is heavy in third world countries, but even some first world nations in Europe. Their Huawei technology that they're trying to, 5G technology they're trying to deploy throughout Europe and others. And a number of commentators, I think, in the United States or experts are suggesting that this is happening in the absence of a vacuum that exists because the current administration has strained these relationships with these powers, and now they're going somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So the question, I guess, what risk does an increasing China investment in other nations pose to U.S. foreign and economic policy interests?
Yeah. These problem sets long predate this administration. And I don't mean this from a political perspective. This isn't just about the previous Democrat administration. This is now 25, 30 years on. This is not a political issue. I spoke to that. There is a bipartisan consensus in Washington of the challenges from the Chinese Communist Party. I say that because what the Trump administration has tried to do is to the first time take on this challenge in a serious way, recognizing that it will take years to push back against every dimension of the infiltration, the connectivity that has developed over 25 or 30 years. You gave 3 examples. Let me walk through just one that's very important. has to do with telecommunications infrastructure. You mentioned Huawei as a particular company, but the challenge is greater. Every one of us has information out on electronic systems. Our kids do. It's everywhere. It's how we do business today. It's how we engage in entertainment today. That information cannot travel across untrusted networks without putting all of us at risk. And so the Trump administration has said, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to permit untrusted networks to be inside the American information system. We're going to, over time, build out a system of services that we know we can rely upon that will have Western values, Western rule of law, central understandings about transparency and openness. We'll know where that property, that information property, will be. This is a big challenge, but we've made real progress. When we came in, Huawei was on the rise, ZTE was on the rise, all of the Chinese telecommunications infrastructure. Look, they were showing up as state-owned enterprises and subsidizing these businesses. And so if you were a small country somewhere, it was cheap and it felt free. It ain't free. Right. There's a cost. You may not pay it at the front end. It may not show up on the invoice, but there's a real cost. And so we have taken an approach that said, well, we know one thing we can control. That's American information. And we're going to demand that American information travel only across in a trusted cloud, in a trusted network, across clean lines and telephone lines. And we're going to get there. I'm very confident. By the way, this isn't anti-China. Anybody who shows up, there'll be a certification process. If the technology complies with that, that is, we can come to understand that information has a chain of custody that we can come to trust, then that can come in. The source of it is immaterial. That is, if it's built in China or Europe or Wisconsin, so be it. We have the national security imperative to get this right. Otherwise, we will live in an information system that looks more like the one that's inside of China today. Right? A gated, firewalled, compartmentalized for private citizens, and a massive Orwellian state from the central government. This is not the world that the American people or the people of Europe or frankly people in Africa or Asia want to live in. And we have begun to turn course in the telecommunications infrastructure and in other places, which begins to chart the right path for freedom and liberty.
And it seems like that's paying some positive results just in European countries turning away from Huawei in particular, some of them at any rate.
Look, the first thing with everybody knows the 12-step program, right? I have a problem. The world has this challenge, and we had to go acknowledge. The first thing we had to do is, and I spent my first 6-8 months traveling the world, sharing data and facts about risk, political risk, economic risk, military risk, security and privacy risk for the information belonging to your citizens. And that information effort, just going out there and making sure everybody recognized the risk, has in fact led there to be big changes in how the world thinks about engaging with the Chinese Communist Party.
So the next question comes from Representative Jim Steineke, and it kind of goes along on the trade issue. And oftentimes when we have national figures, at that level engaging in discussions, it doesn't translate down to Wisconsinites in their small businesses, on their farms, and what impacts that might have. We see over the first few years of actually up until the COVID crisis, almost like a ping pong ball, our trade and the retaliation and tariffs between us and China just going back and forth. His question is, how can we ensure that we're holding China accountable for their abuses in trade and monetary practices, while at the same time making sure that we're keeping our Wisconsin businesses here competitive and afloat?
Yeah. So I go back to what President Trump talked about during his first campaign back in 2015 and throughout 2016. He talked about where we were with respect to where a small Kansas business sat vis China. If that small Kansas business wanted to invest in China, it couldn't own a majority control. The Chinese company equivalent could own one here in the United States. The trade relationship was grossly different. There were huge tariffs. The Chinese Communist Party managed to convince the world that they're still a developing nation. They get the enormous advantages that come from being a developing nation inside the WTO. It's cheaper products, where a Wisconsin company or Kansas company has no shot at competing with that. And so the president set about trying to identify the tools that we had available to turn the course, to change the nature of the relationship, the trade and economic relationship between the United States and China. So the first effort was to reach out to the Chinese and say, we want to negotiate a fair and equitable and reciprocal trade agreement. And so said about it from the beginning. It didn't make a lot of progress. So he began to use America's economic power through the tool of tariffs to impose real cost on Chinese businesses. He's mindful that had an impact on American business as well, to the good for some, to the detriment of others. Certainly, Kansas agricultural community was impacted by those tariffs as well. We have to flip the nature of the relationship. It's imperative. We have to get on an equal footing. And if there are costs in the short run, I am convinced that most Americans are prepared to say, I'll do that. That's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do for freedom, democracy. It will ultimately be the right thing to do for their business as well. And so we've tried to ameliorate the harms to small and medium businesses here in the near term for what will be an enormously important strategic shift, which will benefit every American business, from the smallest business in Wisconsin to medium-sized businesses in places like Kansas and Iowa, and to the larger businesses that are operating on a global scale, where they'll have the real opportunity tactically to compete on a fair and level playing field. That's the mission set. That's the purpose of the tariffs. The president's been very clear. He'd love to live in a world, no tariffs, no trade barriers, wide open, let the finest compete. I am confident that Wisconsinites would crush it, given that opportunity. But to get there, there have had to be costs imposed. And the president is determined to continue to do that, to deliver the right outcomes for Wisconsin businesses and for businesses all across the country.
Yeah, thank you. The next question comes straight from me.
Right.
And it deals with your Commission on Unalienable Rights, which I have been following with some interest.